All right, our Docker file is almost ready. Now, how do we start our application? Well, earlier you saw that here in the project directory, we can start the application by running npm start. So this is the command that we should execute when starting a container. So let's start a container, docker run. Now we're not going to use the interactive mode because we don't want to interact with this container. We're not going to run a shell session. We just want to start the application. So we type the image name. Now let's see if we execute this command up to this point. Our container started and then stopped because we didn't specify a command or a program to execute. So this is where we're going to type npm start. Take a look. All right, we got a permission error. Look over here. Permission denied. Can you tell why we're getting this error? Think about it for a few seconds, and I'll give you a hint. Look at the Docker file. Here's the answer. In our Docker file, we set the user at the end. So we executed all these previous instructions as the root user, but then we switched to a regular user with limited privileges. So we should move these two lines on the top. So first, we set the user, then we create the working directory, copy files, and so on. Now we have to rebuild our image and start a new container. So back in the terminal, let's stop this process by pressing Ctrl and C. Good. Now, docker build -t React app, period. All right, our image is ready. So let's start a new container. All right, our web server started on port 3000. But as I told you before, this is port 3000 of the container, not localhost. So if we go to this address, we're not going to be able to access the application. In the next section, I will show you how to map a port from the host to a port on the container. Okay. Now, let's stop this process. Let's bring up the run command. Now, here's a problem. We don't want to have to specify this command every time we start a container. This is where we use the command instruction. So back to our Docker file. At the end, using the command instruction, we can supply a default command to be executed. So npm start. Now, back to the terminal. Once we rebuild the image, then we can start a container by simply running docker run React app. We don't have to specify the command here. Great. Just remember, because the command instruction is for supplying the default command, it doesn't make sense to have multiple command instructions in a Docker file. If you have multiple command instructions, only the last one will take effect. Okay? Be aware of that. Now, you might be wondering, what is the difference between the command instruction and run? Because with both these, we can execute commands. Here's the difference. The run instruction is a build time instruction. So this is executed at the time of building the image. So when building the image, we're installing npm dependencies, and these dependencies are stored in the image. In contrast, the command instruction is a runtime instruction. So it's executed when starting a container. Okay? Now, this command instruction has two forms. What you see here is called the shell form. We also have another form called execute form, which takes an array of strings. So npm and start. What is the difference? Well, if we use this syntax, Docker will execute this command inside a separate shell. That is why it's called the shell form. Now, on Linux, that shell is /bin/shell, the original shell program. On Windows, it's CMD or command prompt. Now, the common best practice is to use the execute form, because with this, we can execute this command directly, and there's no need to spin up another shell process. Also, this makes it easier and faster to clean up resources when you stop containers. So always use the execute form. So let's get rid of these. So here's our command instruction. Now we also have another instruction called entry point, which is very similar to command. So it has two forms, the shell form or the execute form. So it takes an array of strings. Now, what is the difference? Well, we can always overwrite the default command when starting a container. So back to the terminal, when we run this container, we can supply another command. So we can say echo hello, and this will overwrite this command over here. So for the same reason, here we can run a shell session, and of course, we want to use the interactive mode. Now, in contrast, we cannot easily overwrite the entry point when running a container. If you want to do that, we have to use the entry point option. Now, a lot of people forget to use this. That's why it's a little bit harder to overwrite the entry point. So in practical terms, we often want to use entry point when we know for sure that this is the command or this is the program that should be executed whenever we start a container. There is no exception. In contrast, with the command instruction, we have a bit more flexibility. We can always overwrite this. So we want to use this instruction for executing ad hoc commands in a container. Now, which instruction you use is a matter of personal preference. With both these instructions, we can supply a default command. Some people prefer the command instruction, other people prefer the entry point. I personally prefer the former, so I'm going to get rid of this. Good. So our Docker file is in a good shape, but if you have noticed, our builds are slow. We'll talk about optimizing them next.